At 5:47 a.m., my banking app flashed a message I had never seen before: access denied. My trust fund account, the one holding $520,000 left to me by my grandfather, had been frozen overnight. At first, I assumed it was a technical error. Then I called the bank. What the manager told me made my hands go numb. Someone had submitted a power of attorney 4 days earlier, giving another person control over my money. When I asked who signed it, there was a long silence. Then he said two names that changed everything: my mother and father. I was never the kind of person who checked my banking app before sunrise. My mornings were usually predictable.
Coffee.
Email. A quick look at the news before getting ready for work. But at 5:47 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, a single notification changed everything. Access denied. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Still half asleep, I rubbed my eyes and tried logging in again. Same message. Access denied. I entered my password carefully. Then, again. Nothing. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. The account wasn't just any account. It was the trust fund my grandfather had established before he passed away. Over the years, Careful Investments had grown it to just over $520,000. I rarely touched it. Grandfather always said it wasn't meant for spending sprees. It was meant to provide security when life became uncertain. Now I couldn't even see the balance. I got out of bed and moved to the kitchen, trying to stay calm. Technical problems happened all the time. Servers failed. Apps crashed. But when I opened the bank's website on my laptop, the same message appeared. Access denied. My heart started beating faster. I immediately called customer service. After several minutes of verification, the representative's tone changed. "Mr. Harrison, I'm unable to discuss the account details over the phone." "What does that mean?" I asked. There was a pause. "I recommend visiting your local branch as soon as possible. The account is currently under legal review." Legal review. The words hit me like ice water. Why would my account be under legal review? "I'm sorry, sir. A branch manager will be able to assist you." The call ended. I stared at the phone for several seconds before dialing my parents. My mother answered immediately. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Mom, something's wrong with my trust fund." Silence. Not surprise. Not confusion. Silence. Then my father came onto the line.
His voice was calm. Too calm.
"We had to step in." I froze. "What does that mean?" "You're not thinking clearly lately," my mother said gently. "We're only trying to help." Help? Nobody explained anything. Nobody answered my questions. As the call ended, I grabbed my blazer, my wallet, and my keys. Something was terribly wrong. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid my own parents were involved. The bank branch opened at 8. I was waiting outside at 7:45. The entire drive there had felt unreal. My parents' strange responses kept replaying in my head. My father saying we had to step in. My mother insisting they were only trying to help. Help with what? The moment the doors opened, I walked straight to the reception desk and asked for the branch manager. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man named David Reynolds in a private office. He looked uncomfortable before I had even spoken. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming in. What's happening with my account?" David folded his hands. "There have been recent legal filings affecting your trust account." My stomach tightened. "What kind of filings?" He turned his monitor slightly toward me. A document appeared on the screen. At the top were 4 words: Power of Attorney Authorization. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I noticed the names. My mother, my father, both listed as authorized controllers. "That's impossible," I said immediately. David nodded slowly. "You're stating you did not authorize this filing?"
"No.
Absolutely not." He clicked through several pages. A signature appeared near the bottom. My signature. Or at least something pretending to be my signature. At first glance, it looked convincing. Then I leaned closer. The shape was similar. The style was similar. But it wasn't mine. I felt sick. "I never signed this." David remained silent for a moment. Then he opened another window. "We've already started reviewing the submission because certain details raised concerns." "What kind of concerns?" The filing information doesn't fully align with normal procedures. That answer told me more than he intended. He thought something was wrong too. My phone suddenly vibrated. Mom calling. A second later, another call appeared. Dad calling. I ignored both. David printed several pages and handed them across the desk. I suggest keeping these. I looked through the documents. Every page created more questions. Every signature made my blood run colder. Then David leaned forward slightly. His expression had changed. Concern had replaced professionalism. Mr. Harrison, he said carefully, have you recently given anyone access to your identification documents? The question hit me harder than everything else, because for the first time, I realized this might not be a misunderstanding. It might be fraud. I left the bank carrying a folder full of documents and a growing sense of disbelief. Part of me still hoped there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Some misunderstanding. Some administrative mistake that would make everything make sense. But deep down, I already knew where this was leading. I drove straight to my parents' house. The same house where I'd grown up. The same house where my grandfather had spent every Christmas before he passed away. When my mother opened the door, she looked nervous. Not surprised. Not confused. Nervous. My father was sitting at the dining room table when I walked in. Neither of them smiled. I dropped the folder onto the table. Explain this. My mother glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. My father sighed heavily. We were going to tell you. Tell me what? I asked. That we needed to protect the family. The answer made no sense. By forging my signature? My mother immediately raised her hands. Nobody forged anything. Then how did a power of attorney appear at my bank? Neither of them answered. Instead, my father leaned back in his chair. You've been making emotional decisions lately. I stared at him. What decisions? He looked away. My mother stepped in. This isn't really about you. That sentence stopped me cold. If it wasn't about me, why was my trust fund involved? Then she finally said the words neither of them wanted to say. Your brother is in trouble. Everything suddenly shifted. My younger brother, Ethan. The favorite child. The one who somehow always received second chances. What kind of trouble? I asked. Neither answered directly. Financial trouble, my father finally admitted. How much? Another silence. A long one. Too long. Enough that we needed to act. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because the situation was absurd. You tried taking control of my trust fund because Ethan has debt? We weren't taking it, my mother said quickly. We were managing it. Without my permission? We're your parents. There it was. The justification. The belief that being my parents gave them the right to decide what happened to my money. I stood up. This isn't helping Ethan. This is stealing from me. For the first time, both of their expressions hardened. The conversation was over. And so was my trust in them. As I walked toward the door, I made a decision. If they wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. The moment I got home, I spread every document across my dining room table. The forged power of attorney, the filing records, the authorization forms, the timeline from the bank. For years, I'd worked as a project manager for a logistics company. My job required attention to detail, spotting patterns, and finding problems before they became disasters. If my parents weren't going to tell me the truth, I would follow the facts. I started with the filing dates. The power of attorney had been submitted 4 days earlier, but something immediately caught my attention. 3 additional documents had been filed within the same 2-hour period. One requested expanded authority. Another modified communication permissions. The third updated contact information connected to the trust account. None of them had my approval. Whoever planned this hadn't acted impulsively. They had prepared everything. I created a timeline on my laptop. The more I organized the information, the worse it looked. Every document supported the others. Every step appeared designed to move control away from me and toward my parents. Then I noticed something unusual. The notary information. I zoomed in on the scanned pages. The notary stamp looked legitimate at first glance, but the dates seemed strange. I wasn't a legal expert, so I called someone who was. My college friend Melissa had spent 12 years practicing corporate law. After reviewing the files, she became very quiet. These are concerning. How concerning? I asked. Enough that I'd never ignore them. Melissa pointed out several irregularities. Certain fields had been completed differently from the rest of the document. Some signatures appeared copied rather than naturally written. A few sections contained formatting inconsistencies. None proved fraud by themselves. Together, they painted a troubling picture. Then Melissa asked a question that changed everything. Why were your parents in such a hurry? I didn't know, until I kept digging. Late that evening, I searched public records connected to Ethan's business interests. What I found made my stomach drop. Multiple liens, past due obligations, legal notices. Far more than simple financial trouble. The debts were growing rapidly. Suddenly, my parents' desperation made sense. This wasn't about protecting family assets. This was about finding money. A lot of money. And my trust fund had become the target. As midnight approached, I uncovered one final detail. A filing connected to Ethan had been submitted weeks before the power of attorney appeared. Someone had been planning this for months, and I was only beginning to see how deep it went. The next morning, I woke up with one goal: find out exactly how much trouble Ethan was hiding. The public records I discovered the night before were bad enough, but they only showed part of the picture. People don't usually risk relationships, legal consequences, and trust funds over ordinary debt. Something bigger was driving this. I spent the morning digging through court filings, business registrations, and financial records connected to Ethan's companies. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. One failed startup, then another. A commercial lease dispute, a lawsuit from a supplier, several delinquent loans. Thousands had turned into tens of thousands. Tens of thousands had turned into hundreds of thousands. By lunchtime, I was staring at evidence suggesting Ethan's financial problems exceeded $400,000. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. No wonder my parents were panicking. But panic didn't explain forgery. It didn't explain stealing control of my trust fund. Then I found something even more disturbing. An email chain. Not directly addressed to me, but attached to records connected to one of Ethan's struggling business ventures. Most of it was routine financial discussion. Then one sentence caught my attention. Temporary access would solve everything until the situation stabilizes. No names were listed. No trust fund was mentioned. But the timing matched perfectly. A few messages later, another line appeared. Once authority is secured, the transfers can begin immediately. My pulse quickened. Authority. Transfers. Those weren't accidental words. Whoever wrote them was discussing access to money that wasn't currently available. And suddenly the power of attorney made far more sense. This had never been about helping me. It wasn't even about protecting family assets. The goal had been access. Fast access. Enough access to cover Ethan's growing financial disaster. I continued building my timeline. The emails. The debt records. The legal filings. The bank documents. Piece by piece, they started fitting together. Then I found the detail that removed all remaining doubt. A projected repayment schedule. The document estimated that funds would become available within days of obtaining account control. Days. Not months. Not eventually. Days. They weren't considering whether to use my money. They were preparing to use it. I sat silently at my desk, staring at the screen. The realization hurt more than the forgery itself. My parents hadn't made a desperate mistake. They had made a plan. And in that plan, my permission had never mattered at all. For the first time, anger replaced shock. And I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I called an attorney the following morning. Not because I wanted a lawsuit. Not because I wanted revenge. I needed someone who understood exactly how serious the situation was. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from Rebecca Lawson, a financial fraud attorney with nearly 20 years of experience. She listened without interrupting as I walked her through everything. The frozen trust fund, the power of attorney, the questionable signatures, the debt records, the emails, the timeline I'd built. When I finished, she spent several minutes reviewing the documents in silence. Finally, she looked up. Your grandfather set this trust up very carefully. What does that mean? It means accessing it legally requires very specific procedures. What I'm seeing here raises multiple concerns. I felt a small sense of relief. For days I had questioned my own judgment. Now an expert was confirming my suspicions. Rebecca continued reviewing the paperwork. This isn't something you should handle alone. What happens next? We preserve every record, notify the bank formally, and request a complete investigation. For the first time since seeing access denied, I felt like I had a plan. That afternoon, Rebecca contacted the bank's compliance department. Within hours, they opened a formal review. Every document connected to the trust account was secured. Submission records were preserved. Access logs were protected. Nobody would be able to quietly alter anything now. Meanwhile, my parents continued calling. My mother left 3 voicemails. My father sent 2 texts. Both insisted they only wanted to talk. Neither mentioned the forged documents. Neither mentioned Ethan. Neither mentioned the trust fund. That silence told me everything. Rebecca advised me not to argue.
Let them talk, she said.
People reveal more when they think they're still in control.
So I stayed calm.
I answered politely. I shared nothing. While my parents believed they were managing the situation, the investigation was moving forward behind the scenes. 2 days later, Rebecca called. Her voice sounded different. More focused. More serious.
We found something.
I sat upright immediately. What? The compliance team identified a supporting document attached to the filing. I frowned. I've already seen the filing package. No, she said. This document wasn't included in the copies you received. A chill ran through me. What kind of document? There was a brief pause. The kind that may explain exactly how this happened. For the first time since this nightmare began, I sensed we were getting close. Very close. And whatever investigators had discovered, it was important enough to change everything. 2 days after Rebecca's call, I found myself sitting in a conference room at the bank's regional office. The investigation had moved far beyond a routine review. What started as a frozen account was becoming something much bigger. Across the table sat Rebecca, a compliance officer named Sandra Kim, and a digital records specialist whose entire job involved analyzing document submissions. Sandra slid a folder toward me. We've completed the first phase of our metadata review. I had heard the word before, but never paid much attention to it. The specialist explained. Every digital document leaves a trail. Creation dates, modification dates, submission records, device information. Sometimes people focus on the document itself and forget about the data behind it. I immediately understood why they were interested. Did you find something? Sandra nodded. Several things. My pulse quickened. The specialist opened a report. The power of attorney was submitted 4 days ago. That's accurate. I waited. However, portions of the supporting documentation were created much earlier. How much earlier? Nearly 3 months earlier. The room suddenly felt smaller. 3 months. That meant this wasn't a last-minute decision. It was preparation. Planning. Sandra turned another page. The timeline provided by her parents doesn't match the document history. I wasn't surprised anymore. Only disappointed. Then the specialist continued. There's another issue. He pointed to a section of the report. One supporting file appears to have been modified after the submission process began. Rebecca frowned. Modified by whom? We're still verifying that. I stared at the report. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. For weeks my parents had insisted they were acting out of concern. But concern doesn't usually involve months of preparation. Concern doesn't require altered documents. Sandra leaned forward. The bank has not reached final conclusions. But, I asked. But the evidence increasingly suggests this was not a misunderstanding. No one said the word fraud.
No one needed to.
The implication hung in the air. That evening my mother called again. This time I answered. Her voice sounded anxious. Honey, we need to talk before things get out of hand. Out of hand. The phrase caught my attention immediately. Not before the truth came out. Not before misunderstandings were cleared up. Before things got out of hand. I realized she was worried.
Not about me.
Not about our family. About the investigation. And for the first time, I knew something they didn't. The evidence was getting stronger. And someone had already been caught changing paperwork after the filing was submitted. The investigation entered a new phase the following week. Until then, most of the evidence had come from documents, timelines, and digital records. Now investigators wanted to verify the people behind the paperwork. And that led directly to the notary. Rebecca called me early Monday morning. The bank's compliance team finished reviewing the notarization records. I immediately sat up. And there are problems. That was becoming a familiar word. Problems. By noon, we were back in the regional office. Sandra Kim spread several documents across the conference table. The notary confirmed handling paperwork connected to the filing, she explained. That sounds bad, I said. It gets worse. The identification log used during the notarization process contained discrepancies. Certain entries appeared incomplete. Some details didn't match supporting records. A witness description provided during verification didn't align with other information investigators had gathered. Nothing by itself proved wrongdoing. Together, however, the inconsistencies were becoming impossible to ignore. Rebecca carefully reviewed every page. The procedures don't appear to have been followed correctly. Sandra nodded. That's our concern as well. Meanwhile, word of the investigation had begun spreading through the family. My aunt called first, then a cousin, then my older uncle. Everyone seemed to have heard a different version of the story. Some believed I was attacking my parents. Others thought there had simply been a paperwork mistake. Nobody knew the full truth. I stopped trying to explain. The facts would speak for themselves. That evening, Ethan finally called. For the first time since this nightmare began. His voice sounded strained. You don't understand what's happening. Then explain it. A long silence followed. When he finally spoke, he avoided every direct question. Just like our parents had. Just like everyone else involved. The conversation ended without answers. The next day, Rebecca received another update. This one was different. When she called, I could hear urgency in her voice. They found additional evidence. What kind? Surveillance footage. I froze. From where? The filing location connected to the notarization process. My mind raced. Up until that moment, everything had been documents, signatures, and digital records. Now there was something else. Something harder to explain away. Something people could actually see. Rebecca took a breath. The investigators are reviewing it now. I stared out the window of my apartment. For weeks, every new discovery had raised more questions. But this felt different. Because if the footage confirmed what the document suggested, someone's entire story was about to collapse. 3 days later, the bank scheduled a formal review meeting. Not a courtroom, not a trial, but everyone understood how important it was. The compliance investigation had reached a point where questions needed answers. Real answers. When I arrived at the regional office, Rebecca was already waiting. Across the room sat Sandra Kim and 2 senior investigators from the bank's risk department. A few minutes later, my parents walked in. Ethan followed behind them. What surprised me most was how confident they looked. My father carried himself like a man expecting everything to work out. My mother barely looked at me. Ethan seemed nervous, but not terrified. Not yet. Once everyone was seated, Sandra opened the meeting. The purpose of today's review is to clarify several discrepancies related to recent account filings. Her tone was calm and professional. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. The first hour focused on timelines. Investigators asked when certain documents had been prepared, who had reviewed them, who had submitted them. The answers quickly became inconsistent. My father claimed the paperwork had been assembled only days before submission. Investigators produced records showing supporting files had existed for months. My mother insisted everything had been done properly. Investigators pointed to notary irregularities. Each explanation created another contradiction. Then Ethan spoke. For the first time. This wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. The room became quiet. Sandra looked directly at him. What exactly wasn't supposed to hurt anyone? Ethan hesitated. My father immediately interrupted. We were trying to protect the family. The same line again. The same justification. But now it sounded weaker. Because evidence doesn't care about intentions. Evidence only cares about facts. For another hour, investigators reviewed records, dates, and communications. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The documents did all the talking. Then Ethan tried a different approach. He spoke about financial pressure, about mistakes, about stress. It sounded almost like an apology. Almost. But not quite. Because he still avoided discussing the forged authority. The room remained silent as Sandra organized several folders. Then she looked toward the investigators. I believe we're ready to review the final evidence package. My father's confidence vanished. Immediately. The change was impossible to miss. Sandra opened a sealed folder. We recently obtained materials that were unavailable during the initial review. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Ethan seemed frozen. I looked across the table at my parents. For the first time since this began, they looked worried. Truly worried. Then Sandra placed several photographs on the table. And I realized the evidence they had been hiding from everyone was finally about to become impossible to deny. Sandra allowed the silence to linger. Nobody reached for the photographs. Nobody asked questions. The tension in the room was already doing enough damage. Then she began laying out the evidence, one piece at a time. The first photographs came from surveillance footage collected from the filing location connected to the notarization process. The images weren't dramatic. No secret meetings. No shocking confrontations. Just clear timestamps and clear faces. And they immediately created a problem. A major one. My father had repeatedly stated that he was not present during key parts of the filing process. The photographs showed otherwise. He was there. Not once. Multiple times. Sandra calmly slid another document across the table. This timeline was provided during the review. My father nodded cautiously. It is accurate. Sandra pointed to several dates. Then to the surveillance records. Then to the metadata reports. The timelines didn't match. Not even close. For the first time, nobody offered an explanation. Because there wasn't a reasonable one. Next came the digital records. Investigators demonstrated when files had been created, when they had been modified, and when they had been submitted. Months of preparation appeared on the screen. The room felt colder with every slide. My mother attempted to explain. We were under enormous pressure. Sandra listened politely, then asked a simple question. Why were supporting documents being prepared before any claimed emergency existed? No answer came. Ethan stared at the table. My father looked toward the wall. The explanation had finally reached its limit. Then investigators revealed another discovery. Account control planning documents. Internal notes discussing projected access timelines. Estimated transfer windows. Financial assumptions based on obtaining authority over the trust account. My stomach tightened. Because the language was unmistakable. This wasn't preparation for helping me. This was preparation for using my money. Days before any authority had even been approved. Days before anyone had spoken to me. Rebecca leaned forward. So, account access was being anticipated in advance. One investigator nodded. The records strongly suggest that. Ethan finally spoke. His voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far. Nobody responded. There was nothing left to say. The evidence had already spoken. The family story about protection and temporary assistance was collapsing under its own weight. Months of planning. Weeks of document preparation. Multiple inconsistencies. Altered records. Everything pointed in the same direction. Sandra closed the final folder. The room remained silent. Then she looked directly at everyone seated at the table. Our investigation is nearly complete. My parents exchanged a glance. A worried one, because they finally understood what I had known for days. The truth wasn't being questioned anymore. The only remaining question was how severe the consequences would be once the final findings became official. When the formal review ended, nobody left immediately. The room felt frozen. For weeks, everyone had been arguing about intentions, misunderstandings, and family obligations. But after seeing the timelines, documents, and financial records laid out together, The bigger picture had become impossible to ignore. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was sitting on the table in front of all of us. The following afternoon, Sandra called Rebecca and me back to the regional office. The investigation team has completed its reconstruction of events, she said. Those words sounded final. When we arrived, investigators walked us through everything they had uncovered. The story began nearly 6 months earlier. That was when Ethan's financial situation had started spiraling beyond control. Failed investments became overdue loans. Overdue loans became legal notices. Legal notices became mounting pressure from creditors. At first, my parents tried solving the problem themselves. They emptied savings accounts. They refinanced assets. They covered bills whenever they could. But the debt kept growing. Eventually, they ran out of options. And that's when attention shifted toward my trust fund. Not because it belonged to them, because it was available. One investigator summarized it perfectly. They convinced themselves they were protecting the family. The sentence stayed with me, because I realized it was true. Not legally, not morally, but psychologically. My parents had spent months telling themselves they weren't stealing. They were helping Ethan survive, helping the family recover, helping everyone avoid disaster. The problem was that none of those justifications changed reality. The money wasn't theirs. The authority wasn't theirs. The decision wasn't theirs. And somewhere along the way, they stopped caring about that distinction. Sandra continued explaining how the plan evolved. First came discussions, then preparations, then documents, then filings. Each step felt smaller than the next. Each compromise made the following compromise easier, until eventually they crossed a line they never imagined crossing. I expected to feel angry. Instead, I felt exhausted, heartbroken, because sitting there listening to the timeline, I finally understood something. This wasn't a crime committed by strangers. It was a betrayal committed by people who genuinely believed they were justified. That realization hurt more than anything. Before the meeting ended, Sandra gathered the final reports. The compliance department has reached a preliminary decision, she said. Everyone became silent. I looked toward my parents. For the first time since this nightmare began, they looked frightened. Not defensive. Not angry. Frightened. Because they finally understood that the investigation was over, and whatever happened next would be based entirely on the facts they could no longer explain away. 2 days later, the bank delivered its preliminary decision. I sat in the same regional office conference room where weeks of meetings, evidence reviews, and uncomfortable truths had unfolded. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The investigation was finished. The questions were gone. Only conclusions remained. Sandra entered carrying a thick folder and took her seat. My parents sat across from me. Ethan sat beside them. Nobody spoke. Sandra opened the report. After reviewing all submitted materials, supporting documentation, digital records, and compliance findings, the bank has determined that the disputed authority filings cannot be recognized as valid. A weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. My trust fund was safe. Sandra continued. All authority granted under the disputed power of attorney has been revoked effective immediately. My mother lowered her eyes. My father stared straight ahead. Neither objected. Neither argued. For the first time, they simply listened. The trust account will be restored to its original status, Sandra said. Additional security protections have also been implemented. I asked what that meant. She explained that future changes would require enhanced verification procedures, multiple identity confirmations, and direct authorization from me. No shortcuts. No exceptions. No surprises. Exactly how it should have been from the beginning. Then Sandra addressed the investigation findings. The bank formally rejected every disputed filing connected to the authority transfer. Supporting records were flagged. Internal reports were completed. The account was fully secured. Months of planning had accomplished nothing. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired, because winning didn't erase what had happened. The trust fund remained intact. The family didn't. Ethan sat silently throughout the meeting. His financial problems hadn't disappeared. His debts still existed. His consequences were still waiting. No bank decision, could solve those problems. Eventually, Sandra closed the final report. The matter is considered resolved from the bank's perspective. Resolved.
Such a simple word.
Yet nothing about the past several weeks felt simple. Everyone slowly stood. Chairs moved. Folders closed. People prepared to leave. Then my mother finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Please don't walk away like this. I looked at her, then at my father, then at Ethan. For a moment, nobody moved. My father swallowed hard. We need one last conversation. Not about documents. Not about investigations. Not about money. A real conversation. The kind we should have had before any of this started. I didn't answer immediately, because part of me wasn't sure there was anything left to say. Yet another part knew this story wasn't truly over. Not until we faced each other without lawyers, investigators, or evidence sitting between us. 3 evenings later, we met at my parents' house. The same dining room where they had first tried to justify taking control of my trust fund. Only this time, nobody had prepared talking points. Nobody had documents. Nobody had excuses ready. Just 4 people sitting around a table that suddenly felt much smaller than I remembered. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then my mother broke the silence. We never wanted this to happen. I looked at her calmly. It already happened. The words landed harder than I intended. My father sighed and rubbed his forehead. For the first time in weeks, he looked older, tired, defeated. We thought we could fix Ethan's situation before it got worse. I nodded. I know. Then you understand. No, I said quietly. I understand why you were scared. I don't understand why you chose me to pay for it. Silence returned. Because there wasn't a good answer. Ethan finally looked up. His confidence was gone. The defensiveness was gone too. I messed up. Nobody interrupted him. I kept thinking I could recover. Every bad decision felt temporary. Every loss felt fixable. His voice cracked slightly. And when everything started collapsing, I let Mom and Dad believe there was still a way out. I studied my younger brother. For the first time, he wasn't blaming circumstances. He wasn't blaming bad luck. He wasn't blaming anyone else. He was accepting responsibility. Unfortunately, it came far too late. My mother wiped away tears. We were trying to save our family. I shook my head.
No.
You were trying to save Ethan. The room went quiet again, because everyone knew it was true. For years, Ethan had received extra chances, extra support, extra protection. Whenever consequences appeared, someone stepped in to soften them. This time, they had decided that someone should be me. My father looked down at the table. We failed you. The admission surprised me. Not because it wasn't true, because I never expected to hear it. We treated your trust fund like it belonged to the family instead of belonging to you. I nodded slowly. That's exactly what happened. No one argued. No one defended themselves. The facts no longer allowed it. Eventually I stood. I don't hate any of you. 3 pairs of eyes lifted toward me. But trust doesn't come back because someone apologizes. Nobody spoke, because they understood. I wasn't ending the relationship, but I was changing it. There would be boundaries now. Real ones. And for the first time in my life, my parents realized forgiveness and access were not the same thing. One could be offered. The other had to be earned. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet. For nearly 2 months, my life had revolved around investigations, attorneys, documents, and difficult conversations. Every day brought a new discovery or a new problem. Then suddenly, there was nothing left to uncover. The bank matter was closed. The trust fund was secure. The evidence had spoken. Now I had to figure out what came next. The first thing I did was strengthen every financial protection I had. New authentication procedures. New account alerts. Additional identity safeguards. I wasn't living in fear. I was living with awareness. There was a difference. Meanwhile, communication with my family became limited. Not hostile. Not dramatic. Just different. My mother occasionally called to check in. My father sent short messages every few weeks. Ethan reached out twice. The conversations remained polite. But the old dynamic was gone. Something fundamental had changed. For most of my life, I had assumed loyalty required unlimited access, unlimited patience, unlimited sacrifice. The past few months taught me otherwise. Healthy relationships needed boundaries. Without them, even good intentions could become harmful. As summer approached, I started focusing on things that had nothing to do with the investigation. I joined a hiking group, took a weekend photography class, spent more time with friends I had unintentionally neglected. Little by little, life began feeling normal again. One afternoon, while organizing files in my home office, I came across the original trust documents my grandfather had created years earlier. I hadn't looked at them in a long time. Reading them now felt different. For the first time, I noticed how carefully everything had been structured. Every protection, every safeguard, every instruction. Grandfather hadn't built the trust because he expected me to become wealthy. He built it because he wanted me to remain independent. The realization stayed with me long after I put the documents away. Several weeks later, I received an unexpected update from the bank. The compliance department had completed its final internal review. No additional action was required from me. The case was officially closed. I read the email twice, then a third time, not because I was surprised, because it finally felt real. The nightmare was truly over. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset disappear beyond the city skyline. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. No investigations, no accusations, no uncertainty, just peace. And after everything that had happened, peace felt far more valuable than the money everyone had been fighting over. I didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but for the first time in a long while, I was looking forward to finding out. 3 months after the bank closed the investigation, I received a certified letter. At first, I assumed it was another administrative document. Something routine. Something forgettable. Instead, it became the final chapter of a story I never wanted to live through. The envelope came from the attorney who had originally helped my grandfather establish the trust. Inside was a short letter and a sealed packet. The attorney explained that my grandfather had left additional instructions to be delivered only if the trust ever became the subject of a serious dispute. I stared at the page for several seconds before opening the packet. Inside was a handwritten note. My grandfather's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The words were simple. If you're reading this, someone has probably forgotten why this trust exists. I felt a lump form in my throat. The note wasn't about money. It wasn't about investments. It wasn't about protecting wealth. It was about independence. My grandfather wrote that financial security only mattered if it allowed a person to make their own decisions. The moment someone else believed they had a right to control those decisions, the purpose of the trust had already been threatened. I read the letter twice,
Then a third time.
and suddenly everything made sense. The investigation, the betrayal, the boundaries I had been forced to create. None of it was really about $520,000.
It was about ownership of my life.
A week later, I met my parents for lunch. Not because everything had been repaired. Not because trust had magically returned. Because healing required honesty. The conversation was calm. For the first time in months, nobody defended their actions. Nobody argued. Nobody tried to rewrite history. My father admitted that fear had clouded his judgment. My mother admitted she had spent years treating Ethan's problems like family emergencies that everyone else needed to solve. Even Ethan surprised me. He explained that he had started working with financial advisors and repayment specialists. For once, he was handling his own consequences. As we left the restaurant, my mother hugged me. I hugged her back. Not because everything was fixed, because carrying anger forever would only create another kind of prison. Months passed. Life moved forward. One quiet Saturday morning, I opened my banking app while drinking coffee on my balcony. The same account appeared instantly. No warnings. No restrictions. No investigations. Just a balance exactly where it should be. Untouched. Protected. Secure. I smiled and closed the app. The number on the screen mattered far less than it once had. Because the real victory wasn't keeping the money. It was keeping the freedom my grandfather intended it to protect. As the morning sun reflected across the city skyline, I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the fear, the disappointment, the lessons. Then I set my phone down and looked toward the future. For the first time in a very long time, nothing was being hidden from me. Nothing was being controlled for me. My life belonged to me again. And that was worth more than every dollar in the trust.